All right. Yaakov. Yaakov, your father is Mordechay ben? Yaakov, what's your father's name?
Michal ben Mordechay.
Oh, ben Mordechay. All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Shabbos Daf Kuf Nun Hey. We are dedicating today's class to Le'ilu Nishmas Michal ben Mordechay Olav Shalom. Before we begin the intro, when we finished last year, what we spoke out actually was a Tosfos, when we asked that since we have a rule that it's only 6 times whenever Abaye and Rava argue, that the halach is like Abaye, why isn't this the 7th time? We asked because we are not paskening like Rava. First of all, just to know that the third Tosfos asks this question. The Tema Rebbe Amaylo Choshev Hani Bahadi Yal Kigam. Tosfos doesn't answer. So the Ritva says Gavaldik that it's possible. See, we don't know what Shitas Abaye is. It could be that Abaye holds both Tzedadim is Asur and Sidei Tzedadim is Asur. And we who take a paskin the way the Gemara says that Tzedadim is mutter, and Tzedadim is Asur, and Sidei Tzedadim is mutter. It's taka not like Rava, but it's not like Abaye, Gavaldik. So that's why we can't put them in the 6th Yalkigam. Okay, we're starting today with the Mishnah. We're going to be learning 2 general topics, and God willing, we'll get into the third if we have enough time. The first topic will be, what ways may one prepare food for animals on Shabbos? And basically, as we'll learn the Mishnah, which is very vague, there'll be a machlokes between the Amoraim, Rav Yehuda, and Rav Huna. It's good to halt up today between Rav Yehuda, the Amoira, versus Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. The machlokes between them is the following. There's something called Shavuye Oichlin. Shavuye Oichlin means if food prior to Shabbos was bechlal not edible for animals. So are you allowed to do something on Shabbos that will make them edible? And then there's another question, if something is already edible and you want to do something on Shabbos to enhance it. This is all for animals. So Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Huna take opposite positions in these 2 topics. In other words, either you are allowed to enhance, but you can't make it edible, or you could make it edible, but enhancing it is already called a tircha. That's not needed because it's already edible. And accordingly, they will learn the Mishnah mamish in 2 opposite ways. We're going to have on Daf Kuf Nun Hey Amud Beis a Mishnah that's going to have, again, the topic there won't be about preparing food for eating, but it's going to be about ways that one may or may not feed animals on Shabbos. And we're going to specifically be speaking about one of the ways they fed animals was mamish stuffing their food down their neck. and we're going to see if that's something that's asur. Perhaps again, we'll have a machlokes between Rav Yehuda and Rav Chizda. Maybe stuffing down the neck, biyad is mutter, but with the keli is asur. There is a certain point where the force feeding will be asur to be done on Shabbos. And if we'll have enough time, we're going to go back. The Gemara is going to speak in greater length about the malacha of lush, about kneading. And really, it's a machlokes tanoi, how to define kneading. Is it either like Rabbi, just mixing, let's say, flour and water, even though you didn't thoroughly make it into a dough, the fact that you poured water into the flour, that alone is already called lush? Or the Tanach Rabbi Yosi but Rabbi Yehuda that says kneading is only when you make it into one gush, and if you don't do so, it's not lush midairaisa, it's only lush midrabanan. And once it's only lush midrabanan, if you were to do any other shinoi or any shinoi, then it already becomes mutter completely. And we mentioned this bekitzur a few daf ago about the concept that by lush, perhaps, as we'll call this, a double shinoi will render it mutter lachatchila. Let us start on daf kuf nun hey amud aleph. We left off by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu malachim shar kolim v'dvar. Matirein pikiyei amir lifnei abehema. Pikiyin means bundles. Says the Mishnah, we are allowed to untie bundles of amir, bundles of straw in front of animals. In other words, rendering that edible for animals. And I'm going to be very vague because we'll see in soon in the Gemara, there's mamish two opposite ways of learning the Mishnah. We may scatter the kippin, scattering kippin. Let's go with Rav Yehuda one approach that sometimes food is already edible, it's untied, but it becomes a lot more palatable, a lot more edible for animals if you scatter them. When they're together, they're moist, they might not have such a good odor. Scattering them is an act of enhancing food for animals. This is also something that you may do. That's the way we learn right now. The Mishnah on Shabbos, avaloya sazirin, but not zirin. Now, what is zirin and what may you not do to zirin? Let's leave it like this because, again, there's a machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda and Afuna, and it's mamish opposites. Next thing in the Mishnah, ein meraskin es hashachas. You're not allowed to shred. Shachas, Rashi says, is aspasta. It's a certain type of food that when you shred it, let's say it becomes either edible or more edible, or veloya secharuvim, or to shred carob, buxid in front of an animal. And according to the Tanach, that is also whether you're feeding a daka, that means a behema daka, whether you're feeding a behema gasa. However, Rabbi Yehuda, the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda says that you are allowed to shred carobs if you're feeding it for a behema daka. Again, one way of learning it is because the behema daka b'chlal cannot eat it if it's unshredded. So therefore, you're not enhancing, you're making it edible. And making it edible is something that's permitted. Okay, I know it's very vague. And now the Gemara, as we mentioned, is going to start with a mamish minakotza elakotza, opposite ways of understanding the Mishnah. Let's start with Shitas Rav Huna. Says the Gemara Amar Rav Huna, that when you read in the Mishnah, you should know that pikiyin and kipin is referring to the same thing. So when the Mishnah says matirin pikiyei amir, right? And then when the Mishnah says later umefaspasin asakipin, right, untying and scattering, it's referring both to straw. Narvos then, pikiyin is said if you have a bundle that's only tied twice. And the Mishnah says you can untie it. Kipin is a bundle that's tied 3 times, not only in each end, but also tied in the middle. And that's something that according to Rav Huna, you may untie. And scattering would mean also untying the 3. Zirin, when the Mishnah says, Zirin, that refers to arzeh. Arzeh are branches of a cedar tree. And so reads Rav Huna in the Mishnah, you are allowed to untie these bundles of straw, and not only that, like we mentioned, you can untie them and scatter them. And the same is also even if the bundle is called a kipin, if it was tied 3 times, you can untie and scatter them. However, avaloi es hazirin, but when it comes to cedar branches, loy lefasfes v'loy lahater, not only can you not scatter them, which is some sort of enhancing it, but you may not even untie them. Now, why is that? Rav Huna is not explaining. So here, Rav Chizda is explaining Shitas Rav Huna, my time of the Rav Huna, and this is the Nakuda, that Rav Huna holds Kosavar lemitrach b'uchlen tarchina, that if you have a food that's already edible for animals, and you want to do an act to enhance it, you don't say, oh, it's not needed because it's already edible, and therefore it's an act of tircha yesero. We don't say that. Adarabba. Since you're not creating the food is already edible, you want to make it more edible, you are allowed to do it. However, but making food, making something that's before your activity, the animal b'chlal cannot eat it, so you're doing an act that renders it into food, and that is the case of zidin. Zidin is something that if you're not going to cut it up, chop it up, scatter it up, the animals cannot eat it. It's too hard. It's branches of cedar. It's something that you have to leave alone. Don't touch it. Okay, so learns Rav Huna in the Mishnah. The Amoira Rav Yehuda Mamish takes the opposite position. He says that when you read the Mishnah, the word pekiyin, right, matirin pekiye, and the words zirin, they both also, they refer to bundles of straw. Pekiyin, same concept. Pekiyin refers to a bundle that's bound twice. Zirin is a bundle that's not only bound by the edges, but it's bound in the middle. And when the Mishnah says the words kipin, right, kipin is the arze. Kipin is these branches of cedar. And this is what the Mishnah is saying. You are allowed to untie, right, these bundles of straw that were doubly bound. Avol paspuse loy. But you're not allowed to scatter them. You can untie them, but you're not allowed to scatter them. They keep in, and when it comes to the cedar branches, paspuse name mifaspesinan, you are even allowed to scatter them, and of course you could untie them. Mamish the opposite of Rav Huna. Avoloy es hazirin lefasfes elolahatir. But zirin, something that's bound 3 times, right? So you can't scatter them, but you are allowed to untie them. And what will be the rationale behind Shitas Rav Yehuda? That explains Rava. Amar Rava my time Rav Yehuda, Kosavar, that Rav Yehuda holds that shavuye oichlen meshavin, and the opposite. If something is b'chlal not edible, and you're making an effort to make it into food, that's mutter. However, once something is already edible, and you want to do something to make it better, you want to enhance it for the animals, and this mamash, you can see the tzad over here and the tzad over there. It's doing something beyond what you need, you can't do. On the other hand, making something, if it did not exist, you can argue also may not be done. Okay. I just want to point out that we're not speaking about making food from mamish nothing, because if whatever you had before Shabbos is so unedible, sometimes we say it's muktzah. So you have to just, there's different shades of unedible. Cedars are unedible, and doing something to it is rendering them into food, but it's not pshat that it's muktzah otherwise. The question is whether you are allowed to do it or whether it's considered a too much of an exertion on Shabbos or not. Okay, and now we're going to try to look in the Mishnah, and we're going to challenge either Rav Huna or Rav Yehuda's understanding. So this first kasha will be from our Mishnah against Shitas Rav Huna. Okay. Says the Gemara Tanan, it says in our Mishnah, read the words, Ein, the next line, the next clause, Ein merasken ashasachas vesacharuv lefnei behema. You're not allowed to shred, not aspasta, nor carrots before an animal, whether you're doing it legaso, ledako or legaso. And l'choira, the fact that the Mishnah puts together shachas and charuvin, my love charuvin is like shachas, and shachas is something that naturally is relatively soft. So therefore, charuvin, we're speaking about what type of charuvin? Charuvin derakiche, which means that if something is softish, Unlike cedar branches, it's already edible. It's already edible. So shredding them is going to enhance them. We see over here that the Tanach is saying that loitor chinan b'uchla. And that's taka the reason. Because it's already edible, this l'choira mamish is shitas Rav Yehuda. That Rav Yehuda says that you can make something edible, but if it's already edible, don't exert yourself to make it, to enhance it. And this mamish l'choira will be eto yufta the Rafuna. So Amalach Rafuna, no. Yeah, the Mishnah puts together shachas and charuvim, but make the opposite comparison. Shachas is like charuvim. That's the type of shachas that we are referring to. Just like charuvim are generally hard, we know that from Tu B'Shvat. Carobs are hard. Shachas that the Mishnah is referring to is a type of aspasta that is the akushe. And therefore, right, you have to do something to make it into food, and that is takashitas Rav Huna, right? That Rav Huna holds that if it's already food, Rav Huna holds you can enhance it, but you cannot make it into food. You cannot take something that's b'chlal unedible and make it into edible. That's the way Rav Huna will understand the Mishnah that ein meraskin. And eichem ishkachas lo. Where do you have what type of shachas? I mean, not that I know what aspasta is, but it's hard to figure out that there is an aspasta that's not edible. So the Gemara says, yeah, that if you're speaking about bi'ilei zutre, that shachas for donkeys, now donkeys is called a gasa also, but it's a youngish donkey, correct, it's b'chlal not edible. And therefore, Rav Huna understands, since Rav Huna holds, as Rav Chizda explains, that the shavuyei oichlin loy mishavinon, that's why the Mishnah says, ein meraskin as shachas. Okay, next challenge. Toshima, weiter. We're going to challenge Rav Huna, but now from the end of the Mishnah. Now, guys, just to help up, when we say Rabbi Yehuda, we're speaking about Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. There's Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda. Toshima says at the end of the Mishnah that the Rabbi Yehuda argues with the Tanach that always prohibits shredding, and he says matir becharuvim ledaka, which ledaka in legasa loy. Now, mamash a gavaldik kasha. I amrad b'shleima that the Tanach holds that mitrach beuchra loy torchinon, that you're not allowed to enhance food, but the Tanach holds that shavuya mishavinon, which is, by the way, the way Rav Yehuda understands the Mishnah. Then it flows. Hainu the ka'amar Rabbi Yehuda that hecharuvim ledaka name shavuya uchlo, because since they bechlal cannot eat it before you shred it, so it's bechlal not food. And enachanami mitrach beuchra loy torchinon, but shavuya mishavinon, which is why Rabbi Yehuda holds that yes, that you are allowed to shred these charuvim. Elyahu marat mamash, it's mamash the opposite now. But if you're going to hold like Rav Huna, that what? That the Tanach holds, shavuya oichlol lemishavinon. It's only mitrach b'uchlot mitrachinon, as we explained, and we're speaking about a type of food that is so hard, as we explained, that shredding it is not enhancing it. Shredding it is making it edible, which is why the Tanach says you cannot do it. And then that says Rabbi Yehuda, the matir becharuvim ledaka, Shemam should be the opposite. Why? It doesn't go. What ladaka and so according to him, of course you should be allowed to do it legasa, because he holds that shavuya you can make it into food. Okay. Answers the Gemara. Mi savra daka means that Rabbi Yehuda the Amoyre is speaking about to whom you are feeding this form. Daka mamish, no. Daka means a behema gasa, and it's a big doichik. That's not what the Tanach means. This is what the Tana Rabbi Yehuda means. And why is he calling this a daka? The dakya b'uchla fakert. Oh, the larger the animal, the smaller pieces it chews the food into. And therefore, shredding it, now it makes sense. According to Rav Huna, you are allowed to enhance it. Shredding cheruvim for a behema gasa, that makes sense. That's only a enhancement. Only an enhancement is why Taki holds you allowed to do it. Now, what is not good? The symmetry, because when the Tanach uses the word gasa and daka versus Rabbi Yehuda, they mamish mean opposites. I bein daka bein gasa. That Rabbi Yehuda, that when he says daka, he's giving a continuation of what the Tanakh was referring to daka. Is daka mamish kamer, and for this taka, there's no answer. It's not a tiyufta, it's a dochuk, it's a kasha, it's not a tiyufta. Lav dafke Rabbi Yehuda said a shita together with the Tanakh. If they were having a dialogue, then you can't change the meaning of the word daka. Rabbi put everything together. When Rabbi Yehuda was learning these dinim, could be he used the word daka here for behema gasa for whatever reason, and takatzakash. But we did not refute Rav Huna. Okay, now that we did not refute Rav Huna, now the Gemara is going to try to challenge the Amoira Rav Yehuda. Toshima. Now we're quoting a Mishnah, right? This is the next Mishnah. We're turning to Amid. Mechatchin. We are allowed to cut up as hadiluyin. Diluyin is pumpkins before a behema, and the es hanavela lefnei akalavim. We can cut up a carcass before dogs. Just to clarify something, when we're speaking about cutting up pumpkins, we're not speaking about a pumpkin that's connected to the ground. That's an act of kaitzer. Again, the pumpkin is already disconnected. And again, we're speaking about preparing foods. And again, here we have these opposite shitas. Can you enhance or can you render something into food? So here the Mishnah says you are allowed to do it, and you can cut up the nevela in front of dogs. And my love, again, we're putting them together. That deluyim dumi the nevela, ma nevela. Normally a carcass is relatively derakicha soft, after deluyim derakiche. And if we're speaking about gourds that are soft, which means soft means the animals can already eat it. Why are you cutting it up? To make it easier. You're enhancing. So l'chayre, we see over here that torchin and b'uchla. And Rav Yehuda holds, no, mishavinan, but loy torchinan. So it's a kasha v'tchivza de Rav Yehuda, amalach Rav Yehuda. You're right that the Mishnah speaks both about cutting up gourds and cutting up an avela, but you made the comparison in the opposite direction. It's nevela dumia de deluyin, ma deluyin da ashune. Paket. Deluyin, naturally, a pumpkin or a gourd, they are hard, which means that before you do anything to it, animals b'chlal cannot eat it. The nevela that we're speaking about is a hard nevela, which is an anomaly. And therefore it fits according to Rav Yehuda, because something that's very hard is something that b'chlal is not edible, and Rav Yehuda holds that if it's b'chlal not edible, you could make an effort on Shabbos to render it into food. And the question is, that a nevela is hardish without you cutting it up, a behemoth can't eat it? Yeah, one answer is v'psar pile, an elephant that dies becomes very tough. And again, the Rishonim have a hard time, even an elephant is not tough for all animals, but maybe they suggest we're speaking about a dog, and for a dog, a carcass of an elephant is tough. Inami, we're speaking about biguriyasa, zutre. If we're speaking about very small dogs or very small pets, for them, all nevelas is considered hard. But the nakuda would be that's the word, that the reason why the Mishnah allows you to do it is if you have food that as is, it's b'chlal not edible, that shitas Rav Yehuda, you can render it into edible. Okay. And now we have the final, like we had two kashas on Afuna, we have the second kasha now on Rav Yehuda, Tashema. The Tani Rav Chanan from Nardo, he had a brisa, and in the brisa it says that mifarchinan teven va'aspasta. Mifarchinan doesn't only mean to chop up; it means the mamish to crumble up. You are allowed to crumble up together, both straw and fodder, uma'arben, and then mix them together. And lechuura, crumbling means before you did it, it was edible. You're making it even more edible. You are enhancing it. So again, alma tarchinan bu'uchlam. So answers the Gemara, it must be according to the Amoira Rav Yehuda that Tevin B'tivna Saria. We're speaking about a straw that's spoiled. And therefore, this straw, forget about that, it's already soft and small. It's not edible at all. Really, the reason why you are crumbling it up is to mix it with the aspasta. Now, and the aspasta itself is also not edible, because we're speaking about Be'ile Zutre, like we mentioned, that young donkeys cannot eat aspasta as it is. So that is something that is unedible, inedible. And the tevin is inedible. So you're doing something that's rendering them into food. And that's why Rav Yehuda holds that you are allowed, that's the Braisa, that Mefarchinam Tevam Vaspasto. Gewaldig. Okay. Now, Bechlal in life, I mean, this machlokes is so deep. What is more difficult for us? Don't forget, guys, the more difficult is that which is prohibited, or the less necessary. Is making something or enhancing something. You know, in Kedusha, for many people, making something is easy. You know, you do something new. There's the joy of doing something new. Once you did it already, to keep on going at it and to make it better can be very difficult. Some people have the opposite nature, that once they're into something, you can see, relate to both sides. Once you're in a path, you get better at it and better at it and better at it. You have a hard time beginning. And that's mamish the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Huna. In Hilchos Shabbos, the word will be whichever one is more difficult. We say already on Shabbos you can't do it. The question is, what's more difficult, making something or enhancing something? Machlokes amiroin gewaldig. Okay, next Mishnah. So the first Mishnah today was about preparing food. Now we're speaking about feeding food. Oh, says the Mishnah. Ein oifsin es hagamo. There is something called force feeding, and the Mishnah is going to use different words, either because in Lashon HaKodesh, force feeding one animal and force feeding another animal, the force feeding word is a different word, and that will be the challenge of understanding the Mishnah. There are different madregas of force feeding, as we'll see. So whatever oifsin is, whatever this type of force feeding is, that's something that you may not do to a gamo. We're speaking about it on Shabbos. Likewise, veloy darsin. Loy darsin is another type of force feeding. The Gemara will explain each one. Avol malitin. Malitin means, again, malitin doesn't mean to put food in front of it. That, of course, you can do. Malitin is another type of force feeding, but it's less force fed. And as we'll see in the Gemara, there's putting something in the mouth, there's putting something down the throat, there's putting something down the throat to the point that they can still bring it back up, and then there's putting something down the throat so much that they can't spit it back up. And then, even that, putting it down the throat that deep is with a yad, which is not as usual, or with the keli, which is the normal way you do it. So the extreme is for sure going to be asr. And then we'll learn in the Gemara, again, here we'll have a machlokes, Rav Yehuda and Rav Chizda. What's the line where we say it's too much? Ve'ein ma'amirin esoagolen. Ma'amirin means fattening. Now, fattening is also by force feeding. So it's another lashon that's used regarding agolim and calves. Avol malitin. So again, what's mamirin and what's malitin? We'll see all this in the Gemara. Next in, umahal kitin letan nagolim. We are allowed to force feed chickens. We'll see why. Maybe it means not as deep in the throat. All this the Gemara will explain. And not only that, now we're going into lush. Side of us being allowed to force feed chickens on Shabbos, the noisnin mayin lamursan. You are allowed to add water into bran. Now there's the act of adding water, all right, and that already creates a mixture without you thoroughly mixing it. This Tana holds you are allowed to do it. It's not called lush. And not only that, it's not even lush midrabanan. You are allowed to do it. But you cannot knead them together. You cannot thoroughly knead them together. And we're going to go that's lush. Now, there are other Rishonim that will learn this whole Mishnah. The hemshech to the last Mishnah about tircha yisera. In other words, if it's edible enough for the animals, you want to enhance it, you want to make it even better, don't do that on Shabbos. But we're going to go that this part of the Mishnah has to do with lush. Next in, the ein noisnin mayim lifnei devarim. You are not allowed to place even water, either in front of bees or lifnei yoinam, or in front of doves that are in your shayvach. And this will be, let's have a quick Rashi over here. Right, there are 9 lines from the top of the Amid. Either mishum the ein bezoynesayim olav, because these are animals that you don't have to feed, sheyotzlim v'oichlim b'sadeh, because they can find food in the field, or the Mishnah is referring to water that is already matzoi. So then it's something that's mamish there, you doing it is tircha yisera. Or as we'll learn, this whole sugya of, am I obligated, am I allowed to feed animals that are not upon me to feed? And we'll see that whole topic in the Gemara in a moment. And back in the Mishnah, Abel Noisman, you are allowed to place water in front of your avazim, which is geese, in front of your chickens, and in front of your yoine hadresiois heroid, domesticated a certain type of pigeon, a certain type of yoina, and they rely on their owner to feed them. So anything that's mizoinoisean is on you. Like today, if you have a pet, it's for you. And if you won't feed them, they won't find that food, then you are allowed to, and be'emes, not only are you allowed to, once you are allowed to, you're mechuyev, as we learned in brachas, that if you own animals, you have to feed them before you yourself have your meal. Okay, so now we're going to break down the beginning of the Mishnah. The Nakuda is clear. There's a certain type of force feeding that's not allowed on Shabbos, but let's touch each word of the Mishnah. The Mishnah opened up, that was the first line. Ein oifsen asagamo. Says the Gemara, my ein oifsen. Amar Rav Yehuda. Ein oifsen lo evos b'toich mayel. You can't force feed it so much that the stomach expands so much that it looks like the stomach became a trough. In other words, there's a certain type of super force feeding. What, can you feed that much to an animal to make it that much large? Yeah, I once saw this Arab merchant, he force fed his animal a tremendous amount of food. Kuritza, guzma, a koid is crazy, right? 30 saw. And he did it successfully. And the camel expanded. It became so large that he was able now, he was able to load up the gamal an additional koid of shayra. So this type of force feeding is something that the Tanach says you're not allowed to do. And let's go weiter. Then when the Mishnah spoke about agolim, the Mishnah says that ein mamirin, but yes malitin. So was idas. Ezi amra ezi alta, Amar Rav Yehuda, hamra'a, which is what we're not allowed to do, means force feeding the calf l'makim she'eni yachol lahachser. Rav Yehuda does not differentiate whether you're doing it biyad, whether you're doing it b'keli. How deep down the throat are you stuffing the food? If you're stuffing it down to a place that the animal cannot spit it up, that is already asur. And halta'a means l'makim she'yachol lahachser, and this is okay. Rav Chizda Amar, he argues with Rav Yehuda, and he holds even he's more lenient. Even yes, malitin. Malitin also means force feeding all the way down the throat, even though the animal is unable to bring it back up. And why is that mutter? And why is hamra'a asur? Hamra'a means you're doing it with a keli. That's the regular way. And halta is like a shinoi. It's done biyad. Okay, so that's the machlokes. Masiv, Rabbi Yosef, that don't forget, Rabbi Yehuda holds he's more machmer, that if you're stuffing food down so deep that the animal cannot bring it back up, even though you're doing it biyad, it's okay according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if you're doing it, even though you're doing it, it's asur. Rabbi Yehuda is the machmer. Frekt Rabbi Yosef, it says in the Braisa, mahalkatin l'tana goyim, you can force feed chickens, ve'ein sorach le'mishem malkitin. Then the Braisa continues, ve'ein malkitin liyoynei shevach, you're not, ve'ein malkitin liyoynei shevach u'liyoynei aliyah, ve'ein sorach le'ma she'ei mahalkatin. So now, what is mahalkatin and what is malkitin? So, lema, that mahalkatin means the safale biyodayim, and malkitin means the shadi leile kamayu, that you're simply throwing the food in front of them. Then, when the Mishnah says that yoynei shavech and yoynei aliyah, the Mishnah Braisa says ve'ein malkitin, you can't even throw food in front of them. That makes no sense. Why? Of course you could. We have to be learning our Mishnah. These are animals that you are raising. You are allowed to, and really you're mechuyev to feed them. Elolav, no. Mahalkatin means l'makim she'eni yachol lahachser, and malkitin means l'makim she'yachol lahachser. In other words, you are allowed to force feed chickens by hand. So now let's go back. In the beginning, Michlal da Hamra Bekeli. Michlal da Hamra means Bekeli. And that's going to be a Tifta de Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that Hamra is asur even biyad. Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, Lo'ila Mahalkatin means the Safa Levi Yodayim. And Malkitin means that you're throwing food in front of them. You asked why about Yoini Shavich and Yoni Aliyah. Well, you can't even throw food in front of them. So that is exactly what Rabbi Yehuda is telling you. Yes, you're not allowed to feed any animal that you want. And even if you have them in your DAF cart, if these are animals that manage to eat on their own, those that are Mizoy Noison Olecha, for example, my friend's chickens, whoever has chickens, they rely on you. So then you are allowed to feed them and you're mechoyev to feed them. But honey, these Yoinei Shavach, Yoinei Aliyah, yes, the Braisa means you can't even throw food in front of them, since Ein Mizoy Noison Olecha, you are not allowed to feed them. Very good. Okay, and Kidatanya, that Noisnim is the only animal that even though you don't own it, you are allowed to feed on Shabbos is a dog. At least in the times of Chazal. We'll see, we'll learn Rashi in a moment. Maybe it's not Shaykh today. But you may never play food in front of a Chazir. And what's the difference between a dog and a Chazir? The dog, it depends on you for food. And this is not, now hold on. If it's your Chazir, how is ein mizoynois of alecha? So if you remember, we learned that there's an isur to raise chazerim. So therefore, al pi Torah, since you're not allowed to raise them, what do you mean? It's not ein mizoynois alecha. You shouldn't have them to begin with. And even though the artaka we learned this just in brachas regarding, right? I think it was in brachas regarding a dog, that you're not allowed to own a dog that's going to frighten other people. Taka, there are limits. Or if you have such a dog, you have to put them on a chain, whatever we spoke out there. But there are times that you are allowed to own a dog. A chazer you may never raise. And therefore you may never feed a chazer on Shabbos.
Rabbi, Yoin Shoivach and Yoin Aliyah, even without a tirche, you cannot give them food?
You cannot give them food. And even though so to say, it's in your shoivach, because by nature, not the Yoin Hadresois that we learned in the Mishnah, that's an exception. They go out and they find their own food. You know, I have chickens. Chickens, they go around and they peck on the ground, but the gardeners, they're not eating enough. The animals that depend on you, you feed. The animals that don't need you to feed them, you're not allowed to feed them on Shabbos. And we'll see the uniqueness about a kelev. Okay. It says in our Mishnah, yes, we're speaking about water. Well, if Tana going to and my tama, what's the difference? Don't forget, the Mishnah speaks about that. And the Mishnah says you can't put water. Same nakuda. Lav mishum dahani mizoynoison olecha, meaning that they rely on you for the water. And bahani ein mizoynoison olecha. If that's the pshat in our Mishnah, then why did the Mishnah Taka only speak about water? Maya maya. Afili chiti usiyari nami loi. We're speaking about you should not be allowed to feed. The Mishnah also spoke about yoinei shoivach, yoinem shava shoivach, and as we just learned in the Braisa, they figure out how to eat. Okay. So the Gemara says, Ella, shani maya d'shchicha ba'agma. So here we have an interesting pointing out of the Gemara that maybe there's a machlokes tanoim. Mayim, for sure, they can find easily. Food is not as readily, depends where you live, available as water is. So our Mishnah holds that type of food you can give them because they are our Mishnah holds. Water is more readily available than food, which is why the Mishnah only speaks about water. That water is something you may not give them. Says the Gemara, Darash Rabbi Yoina, and he's quoting a pasuk in Mishlei. My Dirsiv, Yoidei Tzadik Din Dalim. Tzadik here is referring to God Almighty, that the righteous one knows Din Dalim means the suffering of the poor. What poor are we referring to? Yodei HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Kelev Shem Mizonos of Muatim. Why does the dog have little food? So inside Rashi, from a different time, from a different place, She'ein Adam Chas Olav Losis Lemizonos Harbe. People don't have Rahmanas on a dog. then, and therefore, Lefika, God Almighty did a kindness to the dogs. It takes the dog 3 days to digest the food. The digestive tract works very slowly, which is to the benefit of the dog because he's full if he gets one meal in 3 days. And where do we find this concept in halacha that he digests food very slowly? So Kidatran, this Mishnah in Ahalois. And as we know that a corpse from a body, a piece of a body, especially if we're speaking about a yid, that it also imparts what we call tumas oil. And what were to happen if, God forbid, a dog eats a piece of a human corpse, and then the dog, let's say, runs into a house. So if the dog is alive or any other animal is alive, like Rashi reminds us, there is something called tuma balua. If something is swallowed within a living being, it completely blocks the tuma off. But what happens now that the dog is in the house, the dog dies in the house. Now a carcass of an animal like of a dog is metame through maga and masa, not through tumas oil. But do we say that since inside the dog ate up a piece of a human corpse, now it's no longer called tuma balua because the dog is dead, no longer balua. We don't look at it as balua. So is the corpse mitama tumas oil? And really it has to do whether halachically we say that the human corpse was digested or not. And here the Mishnah says, Kama tisha achilasi b'meya v'yehei tamei. It depends. By a dog, this is the longest extreme, 3 full 24 hours. That means if after the dog ate the corpse, if it died less than 72 hours, it's going to be metama b'oil, because that human corpse was not yet fully digested. And to contrast, minakotze elakotze, by a bird or by a fish, right? You know how long it takes for them to digest it, mamash, just like that. If whatever amount of food that they ate, if that amount of food would have fallen into fire, how long will it take for fire to burn it? Mamish, minutes, right? That's the amount of time that halachically both a oif and a dog, they digest that, whatever they ate. Here it's a human corpse, enough that it's no longer going to be metama b'oil. So that's the pasuk in Mishnah that's from the extreme, that what takes the longest to digest a caliph. Because people don't feed dogs, or even if they own dogs, they don't feed them enough. That's what Rashi says. That's how it used to be. And that all leads us into why you could feed a dog on Shabbos, because it's hungry. And if you're not going to feed it, who's going to feed it? Amar Rav Amnuna, Shmami no, right? That orachara, that it's a good thing, lemishda umsa to throw a piece of meat to a dog we're speaking about that has no owner. Farvos, because you have to, Hashem has rachmanos on it, you should have rachmanos on it. Vekama, however, there's a limit here. Don't give it too much food. We're speaking about a person who doesn't want to adopt his dog. So Amar Rav Mari, 2 things. To make sure that if you feed a stray dog, that they're not going to zachtzut happen to you. Number 1, neshach udnei, only give them a piece of meat that is as long as their ear. So it's epis, but it's not that much. And the chutra, abasre, and then hit it with a stick. If you're not going to do both, then the dog is gonna tag along to you. And then the Gemara says, if you are in a city, don't give any meat to a stray dog, because no matter how little meat you give, and no matter how big of a stick you do, the asal misrach is going to tag along after you. Amar Papa, leis anya michalba. There's no creature that is poorer than a caliph, meaning that they need food. They have the least food supply chain by nature. So therefore, that's why on Shabbos you can feed it. There's no creature that is wealthier than a pig, because since it eats mamish garbage, it always has food readily available. There's a Gavaldik word from the Ben Yehoyada that he says that the kalba and the chazira is referring to different types of golusin, that the kelev refers to the Persians. And he explains the Ben Yehoyada that the reason why in Bayesheni, at least in the beginning, when we were still zoicha, to have the fire coming out from the Shamayim to eat up our korbanos, that it generally looked like a Ben Laden, which is a type of dog, as we learned a few times throughout the Gemara. That's because who built the second Beis Hamikdash, and not only that, that's a schus that they have, who gave money to maintain, at least in the beginning, the functionality of the second Beis Hamikdash? The Persians. So they are represented by a kalba. And the Ben Yoda says that when Avpapa is saying Leis Anya mi kalba, why is a dog poor? Because Malchus of the Persians was the poorest one. They were dominating for the least amount of time. Don't forget, it was the Babylonians that took us out. They made the first Churban. And during the Golus, it was Melech Paras that became the Moshel Bekipa. And then sometimes already in the beginning of Bayis Rishon, it was Yavin. It was the Greeks. It was Golus Yavin. So it was the shortest Golus. And Achazir says the Ben Yoda is referring to Edom. And that's what they're, the Leista Ater, there's no richer Golus, there's no longer Golus than Golus Edom, unfortunately. All right, says the Gemara. Tanya Kavase de Rav Yehuda. Again, Rav Yehuda Chevra, my friends, is the Machmer. Rav Yehuda holds that you may not force feed an animal, even if you're using biyad. If you are stuffing it down the throat so deep that he can't even spit it back up, that's already usher to do on Shabbos. Thank you, Rav Yehuda. State in Abraisa, Ezihi Hamra'a. The Ezihi Alta says Hamra'a means Marbitza Upoikes Aspia. It's a way that you position the animal on its knees and you open up its mouth in a way that when it's in that position, it cannot close its mouth. And therefore, they just stuff the food down it. And on top of that, you don't only feed it vetch, which is food of animals, but you mix the vetch with the water in a way that it's mutter or it was already pre-mixed. And therefore, it's the more liquidy the food is, the deeper down it goes. The nakuda is, he's not mentioning Bekeli or Biyat. He's just giving techniques which whoever knows will know that once you do that, the animal cannot bring it back up. And that's what is us. Halta is when ma'achila mu'umad, umashke mu'umad. In other words, you're not forcing its mouth open. So even if you put your hand in the mouth, the fact that the mouth is not forced open, that means that you can't put it that deep down. And on top of that, the food itself is not a mixture of solid and liquid. It's separated, which also means it doesn't go down right away, all the way down the throat. It's able to bring it back up. And that's what you are allowed to do on Shabbos, according to Rav Yehuda's understanding of our Mishnah, which is a chumrah. Because again, force feeding it, bein biyad, bein bekeli, if you can't bring it back up as us. Says the Gemara Vayta. The Mishnah says that mahal kitin l'tanagoyim. Okay, that you are allowed to force feed tanagoyim, and the Mishnah says that you can mix water in the bran, but loy goyvlin, but you can't thoroughly mix it together. Amar Abaya. I want you to know that Amrita Kamei Damar, that I was learning this Mishnah, and I was learning it in front of my master. This is referring to Rav Yosef. And I said, Masnis and Mani, hold on, to put water in bran, that in itself, let's go with lush, might be considered lisha. The Mishnah allows it. So he tells me, you're right, that our Mishnah is not das Rabim, it's das Yachid. Our Mishnah follows the sheet of Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehudi. And as it says clearly in Abraisa, the Tanya, Echad noisen es hakemach, v'esa noisen l'toichei mayim, v'achran chayiv divrei Rabbi. If you have flour and water, so Rabbeinu HaKadosh holds that if you just added water into the flour, so the guy who put flour in the bowl did nothing. But if you added water in the bowl, that is the act of lisha, because there is a mixture of water and solids. However, Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda says no, that just putting water is not in itself the act of lisha, that you have to thoroughly mix them together to make them into a dough. So you have basically a machlokes tanoi. What is lush? Is it just combining, or is it making it into a gush echad? Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says it's only when you make it into a gush echad, which mamas is the sheet of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, maybe since kemach is something that if you thoroughly mix it, it taka becomes a gush echad. So there he holds that just putting water in flour is not called a maisa of lush. But when it comes to mursa, when it comes to bran, which is what our Mishnah is speaking about, interestingly, even when you thoroughly mix it, it never really becomes a gush echad. So you don't, it's, in other words, either say it's always mutter or it's always asr. It's interesting logic. Since it never properly becomes one gush, since the laf bar gibelu, maybe a fila Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda will hold that only adding water is asur. Because what's your alternative? And no one is saying that since it never becomes mamish, a gush echad, it should be mutter. But here, adarabah, it should be always asur. So the Gemara says, lois al kadaitu. Because the Tanya behedya, here we have a brisa that we didn't know before. Ein noisten mayim lemursan divrei Rabbi. Rabbi Yosi, but Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, noisten mayim lemursan. So that authenticates what Rabbi Yosef said, that our Mishnah must follow that shita. Ton Rabban. Okay. Ein goivlin es hakoli. Koli is a type of toasted grain that if it's oven dried and then rendered into flour, it's a very sweet flour. And when they would do it, the flour is already sweet. So they would add to it oil and water, and we'll see soon on Daf Kuf Nun Vav, sometimes they would add vinegar, and that's how they would make a dough. So the Brisa says, Ein goivlin es hakoli. However, v'yesh oimrim yes goivlin. So says the Gemara now, what's the man yesh oimrim? Amar Rab Chizda Chared Daf Kuf Nun Vav, that this again must be Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda, which is why you would be allowed to do it. Why is that? Because since this type of dough, according to Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda, let's go back to the Mishnah that we quoted by Mayim and Kemach. Midoiraisa lush isn't only you put water together with flour, but you needed them in a way that it became mamish one thing. And if you don't do that, according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, it's not asur midoiraisa. So now that you have a type of kneading that Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda is not asur, it's only asur midrabanan. If you're going to make on top of that another difference, another shinoi, which is what you need to do in this brisa, then even midrabanan you are allowed to do it. And Vahanamili, the Mishane. No, it's if just adding the water in the flour is considered a mice of lush, that's the way we're going to learn, then even if you're going to make a shinoi, you won't be allowed to do it because it's something that's asur midoraisa. A shinoi only brings it down to a derabanan. But if you're doing something that to begin with is only asur midorabanan, here we say that lechatchila you can do it in a mashunadik way, and it's going to render it completely permissible. And the question will be is heicha mishane, and really we're going to have, as we'll learn, we're going to have 4 different options. Let's see how far we get. The first option of a shinoi is yad al yad, which is amazing. Yad al yad means you do a little amount at a time. You're not doing it differently, but by the fact that in the weekdays you normally would need a larger amount, and now you're doing a lesser amount, das is going to come a shinoi. But again, why is that good? Because according to Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda, lush is only when you make something into a gush. This type of koli doesn't fully become that way, or at least we're speaking about kneading it in a way that you didn't make it into a gush echad, so it's asur midrabanan, and on top of that make a shinoi. Now we have a problem because the brisa, now the Gemara is quoting the remaining part of the brisa, and the brisa says that vishavin, right? Machlokes, if yes or no, but vishavin sheboichashin es hashashis vishavis, that one is allowed to mix together shasis. You know what the problem is? That shasis is made from this type of koli. It's mamash. It's a brisa listed, and the Gemara is going to ask it right away. Once we begin the brisa by saying that you may not do it, the eish oiminim that you could do it. Then the brisa says vishavin that you could do it. How does that be? Well, we'll explain in a moment. And just to say the next line in the brisa, that everyone agrees that you can make shasis. Shasis again is this type of sweet flour that they would mix in it oil and water and sometimes vinegar. And another din in the brisa, v'shoisim zisoim hamitzri. We had this on Daf Kuf Yud. Zisoim hamitzri is some sort of beer that was drunk for medicinal reasons, but it was also a Michael Berium. And that was the sugi that we had, that anything that is consumed also by healthy people, so it's not muchach milsa del refuah, you're not doing anything wrong. Midoraisa. It's only in Isra Midrabanan that you might grind herbs. They're not afraid by Michael Berium. So now the Gemara says, how does it flow? You began the brisa by saying, Ein goivlin, you may not now. V'yesh oimnim. We said that's only Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. But according to the Tanach, Ein goivlin, and now the brisa says, V'shavin sheboichashin. So what's goivlin and what's boichashin? So the Gemara says, like Asha, what is asur ava, not according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, but according to Rabbi, if it's thick, even though it doesn't mamish become like a dough, like when you use normal flour, but it's thick, it's dough-like, and that's why it's asur. When the Braisa continues here on Amad Aleph that the shavin shaboy chashin, it's speaking about the raka. And if you have something that's raka, now how do you define the raka? L'chayra. According to most poskim, I want to speak about oatmeal that we shouldn't do on Shabbos, but this is, if you have to for kids, this is where it comes from. You know, there's, when you make oatmeal, or when you make a mixture, what happens if you pour it out? So according to many poskim, ava means that if you turn the keli upside down and it falls out, it's one glub. The whole thing falls out. That's called ava. Raka means it pours out like liquid. Raka, l'kula alma is only asin midrabanan. And therefore, again, you're not allowed to do nisr midrabanan. How can the Braisa say that v'shavan shaboy chashin? If something is only asin midrabanan by lush, and on top of that you make another shinui, it's mutar lachatchila. So here again, the Gemara says, v'hana milei de mishane, and hecha mishane. So we already had before from Rab Chizda yod al yod. Let's finish here with the second. The way of making a shinui, Amar Rabbi Yosef, b'choil. This is people that would make the shasis. They would add not only the oil, they would add vinegar. So b'choil, normally you would first put chaymetz, and then you would put shasis. So this is the normal seder of mixing this together. So the shinui would mean simply by placing in the keli in the opposite seder. The Shabbos place and as shasis, first put the shasis. The shasis is referring to the food itself. And then add the vinegar, which is mamash gavaldik. You know, in the context a few daf ago, we spoke about the avoid of a skafia, the avoid of a sapcha. Like during the choil, in the weekdays, chometz is the sharp. Sharp is the avoid of a non-sadik, the avoid of a skafia. First, you got to do a skafia. And maybe if you're lucky, then maybe shasis is when everything becomes good, because when you mixed a little bit of vinegar in the rest, fakert, it was so sweet that everything became geschmack. You do a lot of eskafia, you have a moment during davening, during learning, where the animal soul, at least it feels like, is no longer bothering you. On Shabbos, first comes shasis. Taka, there is no avodah of hiskafia on Shabbos. And God willing, we'll continue to learn two other shinuyim, that if you only have a lush midrabanan, and on top of that you make a shinoi, it's going to be mutar lachatchila. There's a big, this is halacha lemaisa many times for children. You have to mash up food. And the question is it a mice of lush? So at least we're coming out with that if it's not fully mashed, or if it's very liquidy, even theoretically, if oatmeal will be very liquidy. Now, if you normally put first the oatmeal and then you add the water, if that's the way you do it, if you would reverse the seder, that will be another way. It's a double shinoi. It's very raka, and shinoi, it's going to be mutar lachatchila. God willing to be continued. I'm just going to run over to shut off my camera that got off, but I'm coming right back.
Guys, I'll take the time. Everyone, my wife and I are inviting you and your spouses this coming Sunday for a beautiful musical CM dinner. So reserve the date, Sunday, 7 p.m.
Very nice.
It's going to be socially distanced.
Absolutely. We have a huge long table in the backyard.
Nice. Rabbi, when are you planning to start Eruvin? Is that on Wednesday or?
I'm thinking, guys, that we're gonna see you peoples. We have to. If we tomorrow, guys, tomorrow's daf is the most amazing daf. You mentioned speaker. If you people on Chabad.org, they can make an 8 series from next daf to make it into a big fluff, because we're going to learn about Jewish astrology. If we get through it quick enough, not that I'm rushing, then the last daf will be very little. And if the last daf is very little, then maybe we should learn a double daf Wednesday morning. I'm talking about just adding 15 more minutes. If we learn enough tomorrow, Tuesday, then Wednesday morning we can start 5:45, and we can not only finish Shabbos, but we can start the Eruvin. And we have to get ahead because Yom Tov is coming. I just want to know we have one daf credit already. We have one daf credit because we are ahead of daf. We have to get 2 more in.
Are we having Yom Tov this year?
We're having Yom Tov this year. Oh, Gewalt.
Thank you very much.
Yom Tov is Shabbos Sunday, so for our learning, it's mamish the easiest, because then we're only losing one We're only losing 3 daf basically. If we learn Matzah Yom Kippur double daf, then you're only losing 3. We are ahead 1. We'll try to get ahead 2, and then we'll just have to make 1 more up.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Michael Behema. We're done with Michael Behema.
Thank you.